Hi everyone, I'm Claire.
And I'm Christy.
We're going to teach you some stories about the rich history of Asian immigration in California and Palo Alto. When did people from China first come to California?
They began coming during the gold rush in 1848, over 160 years ago, and stayed to continue to work on the railroads. In later years, they came to start new lives and had to go through Angel Island Immigration Center, which is located nearby in the San Francisco Bay.
Was it hard for them to come to California?
Yes, and even their children had to answer some really tough questions when they got to Angel Island Immigration Center.
Let's pretend that it's 120 years ago. You are at Angel Island Immigration Center and the immigration officer is asking you some questions.
You have to get them all right in order for you to live in California. Listen to the question. Raise your hand high if you can answer it correctly. What is your name? How old are you? What are your parents' names? How old are your parents? That was a little harder, wasn't it? Maybe you won't be able to come to California? Here are some more questions for you. Did you know that some people were asked up to 1,000 questions? What is the name of the town where you were born? How many houses are on your street? Who lives in the third house on the left-hand side of your street? List all their names and ages. How many windows does your house have? When were the windows put in? Wow, those last questions were really tough, and you didn't know the Chinese immigrants had to answer much harder questions than those, and all the members of their family had to answer all these questions in the same way.
How are some of them able to answer all of those questions?
Well, many of them studied up and memorized as many of these facts as possible. Some would secretly write the answers down on a napkin to study on the boat. Check these images from the National Archives.
That's so interesting. Why don't we take a look at what these people did once they passed the test and got into America? As some of you may know, in the 1800s, the Intercontinental Railroad project was a huge deal. Many of the Chinese immigrants worked incredibly hard to build the train tracks. At the time, the Chinese were a racial minority, which means that there were not a lot of other Chinese people around at the time. Because they were a racial minority, a Chinese man working on the railroad would face not only physical hardship, but discrimination too. Let's break this down. Say we had two men working on the railroad. One was an Irishman and one was Chinese. The Irishman would be paid $35 a month and given a place to stay, whereas the Chinese worker would only be paid $27 a month and would not be given a place to stay. Also, many Chinese immigrants face racism in the form of terrible comments and cruel and inappropriate nicknames, often mocking their culture, diet, or appearance.
Wait, Claire, I have a question. Did the Asian immigrants only build railroads?
No, Christy, they built the railroads, but they also did so much more. Japanese immigrants actually did things like growing fruit and farming in many cities close to Palo Alto. Many Chinese immigrants owned restaurants and laundries. As time passed, many Asian immigrants had the means to settle down and establish businesses and send their kids to school.
That's so cool. Did any of them live in Palo Alto?
Yeah, definitely. Let's take a closer look. Here are some videos of what these restaurants look like today. Do you recognize this place?
It's Bukadi Beppo now, but in the 1900s, it was the home of Su Sing, a wealthy restaurant owner from China. Do you recognize this street? Yeah, it's very close to the Peninsula Creamery, but in the 1900s, it was the home to the Mandarin Grill, which later became the Golden Dragon Restaurant. This was opened by Lung Qi, another Chinese restaurant owner.
How many of you know who this is? Yup, that's Jeremy Lin. He's super famous now for being an incredible athlete who happens to play basketball, but he wasn't the first Asian basketball player from Palo Alto.
The restaurant owner we were just talking about had a grandnephew named Paul. Paul went to Pali and played basketball just like Jeremy Lin. He also ran track, and after graduating from Pali, he became a famous dancer who performed on Broadway and in front of the president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. some immigrants also contributed through art and education. For example, Tomo Tana, a Japanese woman who was a talented poet and calligraphist. A calligraphist is someone who uses a paintbrush and ink to write in beautiful letters. She taught a class at Foothill College and published a book. Wow, it sounds like the Asian immigrants were treated with a lot of respect in Palo Alto. After all, they accomplished a lot. True, they did do a lot of cool things, but life just wasn't that easy, and they had a pretty hard time doing basic things like finding a place to live. Remember the discrimination that the Chinese railroad workers faced? Well, sadly that racism continued on. Check out this newspaper article showing how residents in Palo Alto felt about having a Chinatown here. Even in the 1950s, many Asian immigrants struggled to just buy a house. That is really unfair and insulting.
Well, guess what? Even right here in Palo Alto, discriminatory housing laws prevented Chinese and Japanese families from owning property in the city. In other cases, even when it was legal to buy a home, some racist Palo Altans protested the arrival of an Asian family into their neighborhood. For example, Dr. Lee, a Chinese science researcher at Stanford University, was basically bullied out of purchasing an apartment in Palo Alto. Other people looking to buy houses in that building threatened to move away if Dr. Lee and his family were allowed to buy a house because they didn't want to live near Chinese people.
Thankfully, as you can see, Palo Alto has changed. It's a very diverse place and welcomes people from all over the world who want to live, work, and go to school here.
Palo Alto's mix of countries and cultures makes our lives richer and more interesting.
Everyone has a family immigration story to tell.
What's yours?